Hi everyone, this is our fourth video on the Trinitarian issues, and this one I'm going to call Trinitarian Compromises because we're looking at Jerome and why he failed to do something. And it's not completely clear why he didn't do something, except probably it was due to the Nicene Creed. But he was, at the same time, he was trying to explore the acceptability of bringing in the Ebionite principles of how the baptism occurred. So it's interesting, and we'll learn a little bit more about the early manuscripts this way, and we'll learn how clear the early manuscripts really were because they're coming from our original church. Okay, so we talked about in prior episodes that Augustine meets Faustus in 383. He debates him in person, and they have a letter campaign going on between the two of them. And that same year, 383 is the same year that Jerome finished the New Testament that is used in 405 AD when he finishes the Old Testament, the original covenant. So what's interesting is it looks like he never picks up on it again. If you read Wikipedia on Jerome's life, it exactly looks like that way. He finishes it within 1 year. He starts in 82, finishes the New Testament in one year, a little more than 1 year, brings it to the Pope, and basically puts it at his feet. And then he starts working on all of the Old Testament, including the Apocrypha, which, by the way, I mean, but comparatively speaking, the New Testament is like a breeze compared to all of those books. And so, and of course, he's got to do it all from and he wanted to do everything from Hebrew. He was one of the only people who knew Hebrew in the Christian community. So he is extensively reading and going through that. And it took him years. So from 383, when he finished the New Testament, he did not finish until let's see, it took him another 12 years to do the original covenant, the Old Testament, and he did not pick up that New Testament again, which probably has a lot to do with they don't have word processor. So he's like, I can't go back over this to try to fix, a few little things here and there. So that's maybe what was his ultimate thing, but I also think he had a lot of run-ins with Augustine. But we're going to learn a lot. You'll see how interesting it is, and I can prove to you conclusively that the original Bible, the original Matthew, was in Hebrew, and you find this very fascinating. Okay, so we're going to try to find out why in 405 AD he does not have the baptism account. Okay, so in 383, he's finishing the New Testament. He has communications with Augustine on a regular periodic basis. So he knows this guy. He writes him letters. They're familiar with each other. He must know that in 383, Augustine had this battle with this confrontation, in direct confrontation with Faustus, and then both of them put things in writing. So he probably knows that this idea that this day I've begotten thee has already been broached that same year as an issue that can violate the Nicene Creed, which says Jesus was begotten, not made, and instead in the baptismal account that quotes Psalm 2:7, it says, "This day I begotten you," which you can't have that. He has to be begotten, not made, and you can't have someone who's a living being and being told you're begotten right now. He exists, so it would be a conflict. So let's just see what he had to do. How many things did he have to set aside to help his friend Augustine beat Faustus? So we have so he's going to take the Latin Vulgates and he's going to decide whether he's going to put that in, and he's going to not put in the baptismal "This day I begotten thee." But we're going to see what he does on the outside of that, and you'll see how interesting it is. He's trying to avoid offending people within the Catholic Church, and at the same time he has a sort of a radical little agenda of how to expose them to the other view through his commentaries and through his commentaries. Okay, so in the Gospel Parallels by Throckmorton, he says that it appears that Jerome relied principally on what's circled there at the bottom, the italic manuscripts of Latin of the New Testament. He did not look at the African manuscripts or the European manuscripts in Latin, probably. And so now we're going to go, if we just looked at it, it's called the italic, or it's sometimes Itala. and we'll see how many of those had this day of begotten. Well, first, just so that's clear, if we look at gospel parallels, it's going to look like this little it. So that it, that's the itala or italic reference there, and the others are, D equals Codex Bezae. Justin is Justin Martin. Clement is, there are actually two Clements, and so these are figures, and then it says the Gospel of the Ebionites, which is very interesting, and that's what we're going to also talk about on who they were. And I think I think it was the last episode we showed you this textual commentary by Mr. Welker, and he showed very carefully what each source had the words "this day I've begotten thee." So if you look there, it says "Filius meus tu," you're my son. Ego odi genoi te, this day I've begotten thee. Okay, so it says it, and it has A, B, C, D, F, I, L, R, 1. So that at least is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 Vulgate manuscripts prior to 405 showed it all had this day I've begotten thee. So it had a very strong tradition in the Itala manuscripts. And nobody ever mentions there's a manuscript that didn't have it in Latin. So that could be the whole universe of Itala manuscripts that cover Matthew or Luke. All right, so we're going to ask a couple of questions just to stimulate thinking here. So what explains the long list of Vulgates pre-Jerome have this day I've begotten you? The probability is it is an original reading of the text. And why is it gone? Because in 325 we end up having something that interrupts the proceedings and basically contradicts this day I've begotten thee. It says you can't have an eternal son. You have to have a son who's begotten but not made. So you have to have an eternal son who is not simply begotten. So you can't have this text. So there's the pressure. And the key thing is exactly as he finishes the New Testament, he's in Rome. Augustine is having this battle with Faustus over the very same issue. Faustus is arguing the Nicene Creed is inconsistent with the words, this day I've begotten thee. Okay, so that tells us that. And what explains when Jerome had enormous confidence in the Hebrew Mathew, that it was the first Mathew, why doesn't he follow that later? Because we're going to see he doesn't ever see the actual manuscript for translation until after 393. So it's almost a decade after he's finished the New Testament in 383. And he still doesn't make any changes, and he doesn't make any change in 405. So we're going to try to figure out what was going through his mind. Okay, so in 392, 393, still hasn't seen it. You're going to realize that in a minute. He writes a complimentary remark regarding the Hebrew Matthew. It says in Famous Men in number 3 that, quote, Matthew, also Levi, apostle, and aforetimes publican, composed the gospel of Christ at first published in Judea in Hebrew for the sake of those of the circumcision who believed, but this was afterwards translated into Greek, though by what author is uncertain. And some people say, oh, well, he's just making that up. No, he's dealing with the library at Caeserea, which was a Christian-run library, basically, from the time of Pamphilus in the mid-200s, and they were maintaining these manuscripts. And this is where he's going to end up getting it. Caesarea is on the coast of Israel, about 70 miles from Jerusalem. And I'm going to take a moment here to just stop and tell you that when we're talking about the Hebrew Mathew, it is indeed, Jerome was told the truth, that it was translated from Hebrew into Greek, and I can prove it to you. It shouldn't take me too long. I hope I can do this easily for you. So the Gospel of the Ebionites are, if you didn't know it, Jerome says when Paul refers to having brought a contribution or was going to get a contribution for the poor, and this is what the pillars of the church asked him to bring, he says Ebion meant the church, because in Hebrew, the poor is Ebion. And remember, Jerome is like the only person who knows Hebrew in the Christian community, so he's trying to share with his brothers and sisters in Christ. That's who Paul's talking about. He's talking about the original church was known as Ebion. So in the Gospel of the Ebionites according to Epiphanius, John was baptizing, and Pharisees went out to him, Jesus, to John, and were baptized in all Jerusalem. Now John wore a garment of camel's hair and a leather girdle around his waist. His food was wild honey, tasting like manna, like a cake in olive oil. So Epiphanius goes crazy about this. This is the quote in the below that white segment, and this is what he says. He says the gospel according to the Hebrews he criticized the gospel according to the Hebrews, the Mathew gospel, the Ebionite gospel, for replacing locusts with cake in what today is identified as Matthew. He says, thus they were resolved to pervert the truth into a lie and put a cake in the place of locusts. So in other words, they said that John the Baptist was eating a cake, manna like a cake, you can see it there, in place of locusts. And so this was like offensive to him. And what a blessing he said this, because this is how we can prove that the Greek is a translation from the Hebrew. And let me show you how. Okay, so the Hebrew word Epiphanius read in the Gospel according to the Hebrew Matthew was translated as cakes. So in Greek, egris, honey cake, is in the Greek Septuagint of 257 BC of Exodus 16:31, saying the manna tasted like pastry or cake and egris with honey. So he's upset in that prior quote that they called it manna that tasted like a cake. Okay, and so it's egris. So how do we know? And so here's below this is the Septuagint. It shows you in Exodus. Let's see what this was. Exodus 16 verse 31. Okay, so and it tasted, the manna tasted, the taste of it was as pastry. If you look above that, you see where it looks like an E. That's actually a G, or the G sound, and then it's egris there, egris. So pastry, but it's, we would say cake. So that's the word that Epiphanius is upset about. Instead of saying that John was eating locusts, he's saying they were eating manna like cake, and he's like, these people are terrible heretics for changing the word cake into locust into a cake. So he's thinking the Hebrew Matthew is a translation of the Greek, but you're going to find out it's the Greek that's a translation of the Hebrew from this seemingly innocuous statement by Epiphanius. Okay, so before we get there, I just want you to see I've pointed the arrows so you can see that egris, if I wasn't clear before, he's pointing at egris, the pastry, you can see in Exodus 16:31, he's pointing at the cakes, and this is a Septuagint Greek translation, and you can kind of even see the word egris there, and that's honey cake or cake, or it's translated as pastry in this English interlinear. You see it says Exodus over to the right, 16:32, which means I'm showing you 16:31. Remember that. That's where it's a cake, egris. Okay, well, I can't take credit for discovering this. This was in a footnote by Professor James Tabor in his book, The Jesus Dynasty, page 349, note 9, and you can see a copy of it there below. And basically, he explained that it is clear that a Greek copyist copied egris, meaning he meant to write down cake because that's what it said in Hebrew, but he wrote down locust, which is acris. So he got rid of the epsilon gamma, the E, what looks like an E and G there, and he replaced it with a alpha, and by accident. So very minor scribal error, easily explained. And that's how you got what was in Hebrew was a cake, should have come out correctly as egres, which would have been cake, but it was written down instead as acris, and then the cake became a locust. So you can see how it started in Hebrew. The cake was miswritten down, so it came out instead of as egres, it came out as acris, which was a locust. And I'm going to show you now how it couldn't have come around the other way. Okay, so it couldn't have happened the other way around. The other way around would be in Greek, okay, and it would have said locust, and I would look up the word locust, and I would try to translate it back. And so by accident, I'm going to make it, instead of locust, I'm going to translate from the Greek word for locust. I'm going to end up with the word cake. So let's say I'm looking at the word locust in Greek, and I'm going to go try to translate it, try to put it in from Greek into Hebrew. So the Hebrew word for locust is right below that on the left side, harbe. So that's the word I have to write down. However, the word that was the result, if you think it's going this way, would have been the word Caeserea. We know that from looking at Exodus 16:31, a parallel using the same words. So you would have to imagine that I'm trying to write the word on the bottom left, harbe, which is locust, and I end up writing the word in Hebrew for cake, which is Caeserea. And you can see the Hebrew letters don't look alike. The length of it is much longer, and it just has no similarity at all with the word for locust. So these are not even like a scribal error, like a 1 letter or 2 letters. This would be just like you don't even know your own vocabulary. So it didn't happen this way. It wasn't starting out in Greek, and somebody's trying to translate the word locust into Hebrew, and they're supposed to get harbe, but they end up with Caeserea. It's just not going to happen. So it had to be the other way around, and we showed you how easily that is. Ergo, the Hebrew Mathew was the original and was being translated from Hebrew into Greek, and the Greek translator from Hebrew from Hebrew to Greek simply dropped the epsilon gamma and put in an alpha and turned but it's all to our benefit. He turned what should have been cake into a locust, and now we know the rest of the story. The Hebrew Mathew came first, and the Greek is a translation. The Greek of the book we're looking at, is a translation, because the word locust is in all our Bibles. So there you go. Okay, we're gonna have an intermezzo here to keep things short, to keep it to 17 minutes, and this will be the end of part 4A. Please look for part 4B.